Hello everyone and welcome to Live on Air this evening. I'm David Bell, the host, and with me I've got Laurinda Erasmus, who's a published author, and we're going to be talking tonight about biblical parables and how they communicate and some of the questions that arise from this idea of parables. So without any further ado, I'd just like to bring up the basic question screen share that we're going to be looking at tonight, and you can see it here. We're looking at four main topics. Those topics are mythos and logos, hidden structures, communication events, narrative voice, and then we've had some viewer questions already sent in ahead of time. And just a reminder for people that if you want to ask a question directly live on air, you'll find there's a little Q&A button that you can turn on anytime and just type your question in at the bottom of the screen and it will show up for us and we'll do our best to answer it. So a very warm welcome to all of you. I can see that there are 3 viewers with us already. And without any further ado, we're going to begin by talking about mythos and logos. So first of all, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and welcome Laurinda.
Thank you.
I've specially asked Laurinda in tonight because she is, as I said, a published author and therefore will have a perspective on things like narrative voice and so on that comes across in the parables, particularly the parables of Jesus. Without any further ado, the first thing I want to talk about is mythos and logos. And what's the difference between a myth and, I'm not going to say a parable, but all the things that aren't myth, which I'll call logos. And we can put it in one simple encapsulated idea that mythos relates to the world within us, and logos, that's the more rational way of looking at things, that relates to the world outside of us. So we have an inner world that's composed of myths and legends and stories and parables and allegories, all those kinds of things that we enjoy to read, we enjoy on film and so on and so forth. And we also have a rational world out there, the logos world, and this is where another kind of communication takes place. And that communication could be called the rational world, the logos world. And in fact, that's the kind of book that Laurinda's written. Just tell us very briefly about that book.
Well, it's a cookery book. It happens to a vegan recipe book. So it's quite a thick book with various recipes in there. So one starts with quite small recipes, which is, for instance, dips, which would be 4 ingredients, and it goes right to the end with recipes that contain cakes with could be up to 30 ingredients. So again, one has to keep one's language fairly simple, because immediately if one encounters a recipe with so many ingredients, someone who pages through may actually feel, no, they cannot attempt such a recipe. So one has to then break down the steps. If it could be, say, 15 or 20 steps, or as many as I could fit in on a page, then one has to make every step then quite simple, because sometimes I found that recipes combine steps, 4 or 5 steps per numerical number, and again, one gets confused. So again, the confusion, communication, what you want to get across comes through again, because it doesn't matter with easier recipes right in the beginning of the book. You can't really make a mistake there, but definitely it will creep in with something like cakes or breads, that you have to have exact measurements and steps to follow.
So that Laurinda really does highlight what the logos is about. It's about a kind of rational communication. It involves measurement. It involves very precise ideas. Now, have you ever written a novel or a creative story?
No, I haven't yet. So this was my first book. So it is a book that it's precise measurements, as you say. That one, it's not a storytelling. No,
not a storytelling.
No.
But we'll come back to that a little later on. The biblical world is a storytelling. the biblical world is a mythos world. It's not so much a rational description of the ingredients that go, or the precise measures, the engineering design. It's not like that. The mythos is a kind of open-ended story, and it allows us to start adding our own personal stories into this original biblical story. And in fact, the Bible encourages in its mythos this building up of new worlds of the story. And I think that is a key issue to explain why we read about the biblical stories in church. It's not that we're describing ancient history, it's rather that we're retelling the story of which we become a part. And if the Bible had been written in logos terms, here's a set of measurements, well, it would be a very interesting recipe book. It would be the book of ancient recipes from ancient ingredients, communicating quite a different thing. Now, with that distinction in mind, we're getting a little bit closer to being able to talk about the hidden structures of a society. And the hidden structures of a society are very much tied up with language and the stories we tell and internalize, and signs and symbols. And so I thought, to open this part of the discussion up, we'd talk about the hidden structures of the Afrikaans language. Now, that's a mighty big topic, Laurinda, and you're sort of on the spot here, but do you see Afrikaans as, because it's an invented language for a particular country at a particular time, and you're multilingual?
Yes.
French, Flemish, Dutch,
Italian as well. Yes,
Italian as well.
Dutch, yes,
so
6 languages.
you have all the necessary linguistic skills. Tell us what makes Afrikaans different, and whether there are hidden structures in it.
Yes, there are certainly some hidden structures in there. It's a minority language. So in the time that I was in South Africa, it was very much the language of apartheid. And then along those lines, it would follow probably certain structures that a language is built on and then interpreted. So a language can also carry emotion with that. So in this case, and everyone around the world probably knows that the language of apartheid, being Afrikaans, was a negative one, because to be forced to speak a certain language, if it's not your own, if it could be your third or fourth language, that it's hard to get a message across, or to speak and communicate effectively. That's quite difficult. And I know for myself, I speak several languages, but not all to the same degree. So one feels that you cannot communicate, you can't say exactly what you mean, emotions get lost. So again, according to structure, one can really only speak in very, very simple terms. And again, that is difficult in a society as well, that not everyone would then speak with that same level and communicate effectively.
There must have also been, because it's an invented language for a particular context, there must have been certain signs and symbols that were kind of below the surface, that weren't explicit, but were carried by the language structure. Could you think of any that offhand?
I could possibly think in terms of, again, that it would be a political language, in terms of, and a contrast to a language that was mostly spoken at home as well. It was at the time a language that was spoken also in civil servants. So again, if you don't speak that language, it was very hard to get a job. It was also connected with the church, the Dutch Reformed Church of the time as well. So again, if you speak Afrikaans, and it's just then believed as well that you would belong to a Dutch Reformed Church, you would probably be in a civil servant's job, and you would follow certain political views. So it's all tied up in a package.
It's the kind of package, and not all elements of the package. Well, the package is hiding something inside.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Now, it may seem strange, but why I've asked that particular question is that when we open the Bible and start to look at biblical stories, we're actually entering a language and a thought form that also has structures, some of which are visible and some of which are invisible.
Yes.
And that may make all the difference between how we understand the mythos, which we're going to add to, and the parables of Jesus, which actually knock the mythos structure for six. So we're slowly building towards being able to talk about the parables of Jesus, but we've chosen examples so far: mythos, logos, an invented language that carries some hidden structures. All of these are pointing the way to how we understand both Old and New Testaments, and particularly how we're going to understand parables. Now, just a reminder to our viewers that are coming in and out, 3-4 concurrent viewers at a time. If you want to ask a question, just click on the little Q&A button and we'll do our best to incorporate that question. So now we come to the next major topic, which is a communication event. And you say, well, we're all experts at communication. In fact, I love to quote a survey that was done, a huge survey across nations and languages and multinational companies. And in the survey, they asked people to respond to how good a communicator they thought they were as individuals. And it turned out that virtually everyone that worked in multinationals and educational institutions thought they were much better communicators than all the other people in the institutions or the multinational. In other words, we all think we're really good at communication because we always have to do communication. But a communication event shows some of the assumptions that we make. Now, communication involves at least 3 things. Those 3 things are someone who sends a message. So, Laurinda, say something to me.
Let's say the sea is very beautiful today because it's still autumn.
Right. Now, as Laurinda gave that communication event, she was actually looking at me, and as well as the words, she was, through the use of hidden structures, how the eyes work, how the voice works, the inflection of the voice, a whole lot of other things that were reinforcing the message about the beauty of the day. Now, so she provided us with a perfect example. She didn't know that that was coming, by the way. Perfect example of how someone sends a message out. But the sender also has to take into account the receiver. And she didn't know whether I had spent all days indoors. I might have been visiting someone in a hospital, or a relative who was close to dying. I'd have no idea really of how beautiful the day was, except that because it was a direct communication that involved eye contact and a reading of body language, etc., I was able to make a kind of a mental leap. Now, if this had come to me not as a direct communication, but she had written it in a note and handed it to me, which is how the Bible is transmitted to us, it's just a one big note. We really don't understand the reality of the communication. There's sender, there's a receiver, but the medium of communication is all important. And what the sender thinks they've sent, and what the hearer or receiver thinks they've heard, and what's actually encapsulated either in the verbal or the written communication, they may not really meld together at all. And particularly when you take into account these hidden structures. Now, I'm moving towards this understanding of Jesus' parable, because let's just have a little look in advance. Jesus' parables often rely on the notion of a king. And you grew up in a society, South Africa, where there are kings and South Africa?
Yes, and there still are actually in Zululand, Zulu kings, and then chiefs as well. So, and they're very much seen as the head of a clan or a head of many clans. And again, that is definitely linked to a language in that case. So it would be the Zulu community, and then would speak Zulu as his first language.
Fantastic. So we've got a number of kingdoms and
Yes.
also a number of clans.
Yes.
And tribes.
Yes.
And whole ethnic groups.
That's right.
And all of a sudden, we're looking at the biblical picture. Israel has a king, but it doesn't have a king really until it has King David, and then Solomon. And then prior to that, you've got a succession of prophets. You've got a succession of, I'm not going to call them would-be kings, because they acted as if they were kings within smaller sub-tribal groups, etc. But that whole notion of a king is absolutely key to understanding what the Bible is. Did South African society as a whole have a king?
No, because we consisted of too many different nations, languages, peoples, that sort of thing. It would have been good probably, but we didn't have it.
Yeah. Well, it's debatable whether it would have been good or not. I suppose if you're a royalist, kind of, yeah.
That's right. Yes. But the unifying probably would have been a unifying factor. One doesn't know. One can't rewind history to go and see what would have happened.
That's really interesting, Laurinda, because the unifying factor in South African society was meant to be Afrikaans, the language.
Yes.
The unifying factor in many other aspects of society revolves around the notion of the king. So we're starting to understand that this communication from biblical times may involve structures, both visible and invisible, particularly around the notion of kingship and tribal understandings, that don't necessarily fit in contemporary 21st century Western society. Because as far as I can work out, in Europe and Great Britain, none of the kings and queens have any power.
Yes.
That wouldn't have been true in South Africa and the kings in those particular tribal societies, would it?
No, they still have quite a bit of power, especially in Zululand, and yes, they would, for instance, still rule some of their areas as though it's still way back in Africa, when it was still seen as the chief or the king has absolute power, and that power can be misused as well. So unfortunately, it still continues both in Africa and some areas in South Africa as well.
Okay. Let's just bring the final major part of the topic, and that is the narrative voice. So we've got mythos, logos, we've got hidden structures, we've got communication events. The Bible is a major communication event. 66 books, I think, from 3 to 2,000 years ago. But there's also another factor to take into account with the biblical world, and that is the voice of the narrator. Now, Laurinda, let's go back to your recipe book. I said we'd do this at the start.
Yes.
When you wrote the recipe book, did you use the third person and write it impersonally, or did you use the first person and write, say, I did this?
Yes.
Or did you use the second person to do this recipe? You have to.
Yes.
Which voice? What's the voice that you're using?
Yes, that's an interesting question. For every recipe, I had an introduction, and because again it's a very thick book, I wanted to put a personal touch in there, and also to draw people into a recipe, and also to make them aware of where the recipe came from. So I would put history in there, or a recipe that I've made. So in that introduction, I would certainly put it in a subjective voice, how I have come across this recipe or tweaked it for the vegan, either person who wants to make it as a vegan recipe, or how to change it back again. So I had that, and I had the history of how old the recipe was, and then also alternative ingredients. One can swap it in and out according to the season, all those sort of little things. But the body of the recipe, in terms of the structure and the method, I certainly put that in the objective. So it's not of you should do this or mix this or so. It's just simply pour this in, mix this. So it's almost like soft commands, if I can put it that way. So yes, that is in the objective.
Now, we've really got to the heart of the matter here about what a parable is. We're talking about the objective voice. We've been talking about the inner world of the mythos, the pardon me, the outer world of the rational, etc. What happens in the Bible is you've got a number of voices going on. Like Laurinda's recipe book, sometimes you've got some objective things being described, yes, which we will call the Logos world. And in that Logos world, just as you wrote the ingredients and the measures, yes, the Bible might try to record the genealogies, who is related to who, yes, all of that kind of thing. So there's a kind of objective voice in that. Then in your introduction, you talked about, you wanted to put some of yourself and your yes, personal understanding of how you did this. Where does that come in the Bible? How often in the Bible do you see one of the biblical authors saying, now, this is what I wanted to say? The primary example in the New Testament is in the Gospel of Luke. And in Luke's Gospel, he starts off by saying, "Dear Theophilus, I wanted to give you an orderly account of these things." So there's the personal voice of the author's voice, if you like. I'm telling you these things that you need to know. And you've got those opening few sentences, and then the narration starts to move to something that seems on the surface to be more objective. Yes. So there are a couple of voices. More voices will appear in Luke's Gospel, as they do in all the Gospels, all the books of the Bible. But if I could go back, pardon me, to the book of Genesis, it's sometimes difficult for people understanding this ancient book, these ancient stories, to realize that there's a narrator's voice, there's a voice that talks about God, but doesn't claim to be God. Yes. And then at times, the narrator makes God say something. And you get speech marks in English. We don't get them in Hebrew, but the grammatical sense conveys it. So all of these are different voices that are building up around the communication event. And I'm going to make a little claim for the preacher's voice at this point, because when a minister gets up on a Sunday morning or a Sunday evening or is broadcasting live on air, at what point is it a communication that comes essentially, I did this, 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 and this, and I want you to know about it? At what point does the minister's voice become, this is what God says, and put words into God's mouth? And at what point does God actually speak in the situation? You can see how complex the whole communication event is in terms of biblical narrative, because it goes one step beyond a whole lot of other things. It's like all sacred scripture that purports to talk about God. How do you distinguish the genuine voice of God speaking outside of what the narrator is trying to say, outside of what the author is trying to say.
Yes.
So many different voices of complexity.
Yes.
Now, we've had 4 or 5 concurrent viewers. We haven't had any questions fed in, but we are now in a position, in a very brief space of time, we've only got a quarter of an hour left, to actually deal with the questions that came in advance. And I do want to say, Laurinda, the South African example is just so pertinent to what we're on about.
Right.
Okay, now the first viewer question is, are there any essential differences between the parables of Jesus and the fables of Aesop? Did you have Aesop's fables as a
I
child?
read a few. Yes, I did read. It's now so long ago, but yes, it's and also Greek mythology. I've also read. Yes. Yes.
Right. Well, I know this is putting you on the spot, but if we took an Aesop's fable, which often has talking horses, donkeys, animals,
right.
etc., and it's usually trying to make a moral point.
Yes.
Do you see any essential difference between that and a parable told by Jesus? Let's just take one parable, so we've got an example.
Right.
Let's take the one that everyone knows, the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Right.
Is there a difference between an Aesop's fable and the parable of Jesus, in your opinion?
Yes. I think the parable of Jesus is probably applicable in our society, whereas the one the Aesop is because I read quite a few. I remember one with the black stones in a castle, and also the talking animals. It's nice to read, and there's the morals behind it as well, but it's something to know cannot be true. So we just see it on its face value and don't try to interpret it any further.
Look, thank you for that, Laurinda, because you mentioned the talking animals, I mentioned them. A lot of people don't realize that you have elements of Aesop's fables. I don't mean Aesop's fables directly, but sort of elements like that appearing in the Old Testament. You've got talking donkeys. You've got angels that come with wings.
Yes.
Also in the Old Testament, you've got angels that simply appear as human beings. And so there's all kinds of... Now, there are a couple of parables in the Old Testament. You're not going to find as many parables pardon me, in the Old Testament as you will find in the New Testament, but that doesn't mean that the Jewish scholars didn't tell parables. They just told them other than in the Bible. So you've got whole genres of literature. But in the period in which Jesus lived, and a little bit after, with the destruction of Jerusalem, so on, you tend to find that Jewish parables dry up, and the only source that you've got of Jewish parables in that first century really comes from Jesus. But that doesn't mean that there weren't lots and lots of other rabbis telling them. It's just that the context of the times meant that in that little period of history, you're not getting the whole rich vein of Jewish storytelling that you would find in other Jewish literature. And that's the key to Jesus' parables. They're contextual.
Yes.
Now, Aesop tells a fable, and the fable has a moral point that's universally applicable. I think that sometimes Jesus has a parable, but it's not a universally applicable moral principle. It may be universally applicable, but it's not like an Aesop's fable trying to make the moral point, you must do it this way.
Right.
So in the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is so well known, we don't really need a huge amount of explanation, but it is clear that the people that you would expect in the hidden structures of Jewish society to take care of the wounded traveler, namely the priest, is the very person that doesn't take care. So the people that walk on by build up to the person who doesn't walk on by, but is the least expected to make the application, in this case, the Samaritan. So a biblical parable may have elements of the mythical, part of joining us to the story. It may have elements like Aesop, but when Jesus tells a parable, it usually has an application that relates directly to the person who has to make their own moral understanding from it. Now, let me just develop this a little bit further. One of my favorite fables doesn't come, I think, from Aesop. I think it comes from Hans Christian Andersen. It's the story of the emperor who didn't have any clothes.
Yes.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Laurinda, but it goes something like this, doesn't it? The emperor hires some tailors.
Yes, to make him a cloth. Yes. And in the end, I praised his people. He called them because the weavers then said, "We finished your cloth." And then he called everyone in to admire his cloth. And probably for his ego, they said it was really, really beautiful and it was really finely woven. But of course, there was nothing actually in the end.
And so the emperor has to believe that he's clothed.
Yes, yes.
And it ends something like there's a procession, isn't there? And the emperor or the king is walking down the street
to be admired.
To be admired.
Yes.
And who picks him up? A little child.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the unexpected person actually says, but he's got nothing on. And it's at that point that the world gets knocked for six. Who gets knocked for six in it? First of all, the emperor, because he's suddenly exposed, not just in a physical sense, but in a psychological, a spiritual sense, the paucity of his vision, that he had to be so finely clothed, is exposed before people. But it's not just him that gets exposed, it's also all his courtiers that go along with it.
That's right.
All the crowds on the street that are clapping.
Yes.
The way the world gets knocked for six is out of the person's mouth that you would least expect it. So in that sense, you may have fables that run very close to what Jesus is getting at. As a matter of fact, I wonder, there are probably some creative literary type out there who will watch this that will be able to provide an answer. I wonder whether Hans Christian Andersen didn't actually get that tale by thinking about the Good Samaritan.
Yes, and probably parables in general, that he took the structure as it is and to turn the characters on their heads, so that story is being told, and then suddenly the characters that you expect would act or say in a certain way do not, and the least ones are filling the roles of the ones that you'd expect to say and do certain things.
Yeah, and that to me is why the Bible is such a powerful book in the way it builds up the mythos world. The mythos world is an ever-expanding world. It's not a contracting world because it's an inward world. More and more people attach themselves to the biblical myth. As they attach themselves and make it their story and they're an integral part of it, they're building it up. But it needs another voice, if you like, to come along and say, that's great, but, and the mythical world gets knocked for six most times by the parabolic world. Let's bring the question slide up again just for a second. There are essential differences, but there are also some essential similarities. Second question that came in from a viewer: what proportion of Jesus' recorded teachings use parables rather than normal explanation? Now, Laurinda, just as an ordinary churchgoer, what would you, don't try and answer with a figure,
Sure.
but what do you think? Do you think most of his teachings are in parables?
I would say so, probably at least 50%, so that it was probably done for a reason as well. If it was too structural, too precise, then the parables would probably not be interpreted through the centuries, through the different ages, different languages, different nations, Otherwise, it would have just stayed in Jewish community in the 1st century.
Well, I think that's quite a brilliant answer, if I may say so. You're absolutely right that the parables do form the majority teaching.
Yes.
They're not the only teaching of Jesus. I wouldn't like to try and put percentages on it, but a very high proportion of Jesus' teachings are encapsulated in parables, and parables have an imprecision about them.
Yes, that's right, yes.
And they also arise in particular contexts. So you have to understand not just the parable of the Good Samaritan, but also the context in which Jesus told the parable. And then when you've realized that he's telling it as a story against Pharisees,
Yes.
And priests and so on, you're starting to see how a picture emerges that, as Laurinda said, the people at the bottom of the heap become much more important in the life of the society than the easily recognized authority figures. The easily recognized authority figures is the king.
Yes.
And Jesus' time, that is the emperor in
Yes.
Rome, and his lieutenants,
Yes.
who are administering different parts of the Roman Empire. So, yeah, there is a lot of teaching in parables, and we're going to, I'll be making a video series over the next 6 weeks looking at 6 of the major teaching parables of Jesus, and my aim is to encapsulate each video in 5 minutes. I haven't always been able to keep to that aim, but we want that series, and that will be in Kiwi Connection. Now, the videos, of course, will go up to YouTube so anyone can view them, but I will also be providing some PDF material that is only available to people in Kiwi Connection that can enhance the particular videos. So let's come to the final viewer question. And it's, what new ideas are contained in Jesus' parables? New ideas in Jesus' parables. There are so many ideas. Jesus' parables generate ideas. They just don't generate one idea. They're constantly generating new insights, and that's part of the power of the parable. So, Laurinda, as we come to a kind of end of this introduction to biblical parables, and folk now know that there's a series coming up.
Yes.
Tell me, do you have a favorite biblical parable, a Jesus parable?
It's probably changed over the years. I remember as a child, my favorite one was probably one about the talents. And again, it was probably growing up in South Africa where, excuse the pun, but sort of black and white society in terms of how you believe again, in terms of life is there's either rewarded or punished. And so I like that parable probably because I was pretty hardworking. That suits me quite a bit. But I suppose later on, I like the parables about the kingdom of God. So there's a few there, Lost Pearl, those ones I like, yes.
Okay, the parables that I'll be looking at quite specifically are the Lucan parables in chapters 15 and 16, which relate to the lost son,
Right. Yes.
the prodigal son.
Yes.
The parable of the dishonest steward. We will be looking at some of the kingdom parables, and what we hope, or what I hope will come from this video series, I really do, if you don't belong to Kiwi Connection, you really should join it. There's a very interesting, diverse and creative community at work there. But what I hope is that we're able to engage over the 6-week period, and each of us just a very short little bit of social interaction in order that we can deepen our understanding of these parables. And you will have a chance during this series to talk about your favorite parable. And as always in Kiwi Connection, we've got forum interaction that anyone can participate in. So we've come to the time. We said 7:40, 40 minutes to introduce how to knock the world for six by telling a parable. Jesus told that parable against the Pharisees, against the priests. The Good Samaritan, the unexpected one, knocks the world for six and shows the heart of God's compassion. And that's what parables do. They keep on showing the compassionate heart of God. So thank you very much for watching, and a special thank you to Laurinda for coming in and helping me to introduce tonight's broadcast.
Thank you, David.
Good night.